Let me ask you something. If you closed your eyes right now and found yourself walking barefoot across a cold, creaky wooden hallway, one hand holding a brass candle holder, the other wrapped in a fraying shawl, with the only sound being the ticking of an ancient grandfather clock 2 floors below, would you keep walking, or would you turn around? Because in the year 1886, in a mist-shrouded corner of Yorkshire, that's exactly what little Margaret, age 14, had to do. She was a scullery maid, no last name recorded, just Margaret. And it was her turn to check the laundry chute, which had been making noises since Wednesday. Now, this isn't going to be a ghost story exactly, or at least, not the kind that makes you sit up straight. This one is quieter. This one is about dust and candle wax and the smell of wet stone, about duties and silences, and about what it meant to live every day in a place that no one ever truly left. So, if you're lying down right now, maybe under a blanket, maybe not, feel free to close your eyes. Let's imagine what it was really like to be a servant in a haunted Victorian mansion. The bells never rang in the servants' quarters. There was no need for clocks, no scheduled wake-up calls. Each day began the same way it always had, with the first shift of cold air creeping in through the stone walls, and the dull thud of boots on flagstone far above. The cook would stir first, followed by the butler, then the rest, in an order so ingrained it no longer needed to be spoken. You could be asleep in your cot, tucked under a scratchy wool blanket, and still know the moment Miss Norbury lit the first hearth downstairs. You could feel it, as though the warmth of the fire moved up the house like a memory. In the servants' wing, 2 levels below the drawing room, and 3 below the master's bedroom, the mornings began not with birdsong or sunshine, but with the dull echo of coals being stoked, and so it was, just before 5, when Margaret, age 14, stirred from her cot beside the linen room. She didn't own a clock. She didn't need to. Her body already knew what time it was. The same time it had been every day since she'd arrived that winter. She sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, careful not to bump her head against the sloped brick arch above. The ceiling was so low, you couldn't stand up straight until you reached the corridor. Her boots were still damp from the day before. The kitchen flooded 2 days ago after the rain, and no one had repaired the drain by the pump well. She had tried drying her shoes near the scullery stove, but that meant risking the wrath of Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper, who believed wet boots indoors would summon spiders. So they stayed damp. She slipped them on anyway. The corridor smelled of coal, mildew, and the faint tang of lye soap. The lamps had gone out hours ago. No one wasted oil here. So Margaret moved by memory, one hand brushing the rough plaster as she walked. The stairs creaked differently depending on who walked them. Mrs. Harrow had a slow, heavy pace. Mr. Elridge, the butler, moved with a sort of resentful grace. And young Margaret? She moved like someone trying not to exist at all. Up one flight to the scullery, past the door to the drying room, avoid the loose board on the left. She reached the side entrance to the main kitchen and paused. She could already hear the cook muttering under her breath, something about the chimney drawer not working again. The chimney always refused to behave when it rained. As she stepped into the room, the heat hit her cheeks. Warmth in the morning was a rare treat. "Ye're late," the cook grunted, though Margaret was not, in fact, late. The cook simply said it every morning, out of habit. It meant, "Get the bucket." So she did. Down the back stairs again, out to the courtyard, through the fog that hung like a shawl over the cobblestones. The pump handle squeaked in protest. The water was colder than expected. Her fingers stung. She returned with the bucket and poured it into the basin. The cook didn't thank her. She never did. In the corner, a sack of potatoes waited to be peeled. 6 dozen eggs to be checked for cracks. Bread to be sliced precisely, never crooked, never too thick. Each action had its rhythm. Each motion became a meditation. In the house above, the masters still slept. They would not wake for another hour, but already their day was being built below them. Warm water for the ladies' morning wash. Tea set out for the master's study. Boots polished, trays readied. Newspapers folded, clocks wound. No one thanked the clocks either. By 7, the day was in full swing, and yet the sun still hadn't touched the east-facing windows. In the great hall, the floor was scrubbed in silence, not because the servants were forbidden to speak, but because the echoes were unsettling. Voices bounced strangely in that part of the house. Sometimes, if you said something near the base of the staircase, you could hear it whispered back to you hours later. No one talked about it. They simply scrubbed in silence. Margaret was sent to dust the upstairs gallery. That meant ascending the narrow staircase behind the pantry, where the plaster peeled and the walls were too close together. She always felt watched in that stairwell, not from behind, but from above. There were no windows there, only a small iron grate near the ceiling, leading to a duct that hadn't been used in decades. It always smelled faintly of beeswax and something older. She never lingered. In the gallery, portraits of long-dead relatives stared down with heavy eyes. The Viscount in red, Lady Primrose with her lapdog, and the twin girls no one ever spoke of. No one remembered their names. They had died too young. The staff referred to them simply as the girls, and avoided cleaning that particular frame unless they had to. Margaret wiped the windowsill, careful not to smudge the drapery. Her hands still smelled faintly of potato peel. A clock chimed 2 floors below. 8 o'clock. The household was waking now. She descended the gallery stairs just as the lady's maid passed in a rush, holding a lace collar and muttering about a lost brooch. In the servants' hall, trays were being prepped. In the drawing room, a fire was being laid. The house was awake, and the quiet would soon be gone. But for Margaret, the hardest part of the day had just begun. She still had to clean the morning room, and she hated the morning room, not because it was dusty, not because it was cold, but because the grandfather clock there had stopped ticking 2 months ago, and every time she entered the room, it was still ticking. She never told anyone. Some things in that house were better left undisturbed, even by those who cleaned it. By 9:30, the house was fully alive. Not in the way a person is alive, but more like the way a clock comes to life when it's wound. Each gear, each spring, each small piece moving in exact rhythm, pretending it isn't all terribly fragile. Margaret had just returned from the morning room, her skin still tingling from the quiet that wasn't quiet, when Mrs. Harrow summoned her to help with the parlour hearth. No one else liked cleaning the parlour. The walls were lined with mirrors, not modern ones, but old, rippled glass, the kind that turned your reflection slightly sideways, as if the past was looking at you through a funhouse lens. The portraits in that room were newer, but somehow more unsettling. One showed a former master of the house, a judge, they said, with a jaw so sharp and wide it didn't quite fit his face. Another had a woman in a velvet dress, hands folded neatly over her lap. The unsettling part was that her eyes had no catchlight, just flat brown glass, no glint, no soul. Margaret didn't dust them. She dusted around them. The fire in the parlour had not been used in 3 weeks, but she was instructed to clean it anyway. The master was having a visitor that day, an old friend from the ministry, who would arrive just before luncheon and no doubt smell of pipe, tobacco and self-importance. So she laid down the brushes, cleared the grate, stacked fresh kindling in a careful triangle. The ashtray clinked as she moved it, and beneath it she found something small. A button. Not just any button, a tiny brass one with an engraved spiral. It did not match any of the staff uniforms, and it was certainly too delicate to have come from the cook. She pocketed it, not out of greed, just curiosity. In the hallway, She passed Mr. Elridge, the butler, who nodded without looking at her. He had once been a schoolmaster, it was said, but lost his position after an incident involving a Latin textbook and a misbehaving son of a duke. He never raised his voice, but had a way of entering a room that made everyone else feel shorter. It was nearing 11 now, which meant the master's tea service was being prepared in the drawing room. Margaret was sent to polish the silver tongs. Polishing silver wasn't hard, just dull. Endless circles with a cloth that always turned black. The same spoons, forks and trays every day, though none of the household ever seemed to actually eat with them. Some said they were more for display. Others whispered that the master's late wife had insisted on using only silverware, even for soup. She died 9 years ago. The soup tray was still set out each Tuesday. At noon the front bell rang, not the servant's bell, but the main one, a low, sombre chime that echoed through the entryway and stirred up dust even from the rug. The visitor had arrived. Margaret wasn't allowed near the front hall, but she glimpsed the man's hat, tall, black, glossy, and his shoes, curiously wet, as if he had walked through dew no one else had seen. She returned to the kitchen. Luncheon was to be light. A poached fish, boiled potatoes, white bread with lemon butter, and syllabub for dessert, whipped cream, sugar, and wine. The fish had gone slightly grey. The cook blamed the delivery boy. The cook blamed everyone, but the fish still had to be served. Margaret helped plate it all quietly, quickly. The food was arranged on porcelain edged in gold, the utensils set at exact angles, a sprig of parsley on the left, not the right, never the right. By 12:40, the meal was lifted by Mr. Elridge and carried upstairs. The kitchen went quiet again. This was the moment in the day Margaret liked best. The 1 minute where nothing had to be scrubbed, stirred, fetched, or folded. She sat on a stool near the back door, just for a moment, and let the breeze from the open hatch touch her face. It smelled of earth and coal smoke, of cabbage leaves and geraniums, and something else. She could hear the floorboards groan in the pantry. No one was there. Everyone was above. She stood, walked over, checked for mice. Nothing, only a broom fallen sideways against the wall. Still, the sound had been too loud for a broom. Margaret did not investigate further. In the dining room, the master laughed, a rare sound, deep and full, as if dredged from another version of himself. The visitor said something about the colonies. Margaret returned to work. Silver from the luncheon had to be cleaned again. Napkins sorted. China checked for cracks. She spotted a chip in the edge of one saucer. She placed it in the discard basket, but later found it had returned to the shelf, twice. After the third time, she stopped moving it. The bell rang from upstairs. Time to prepare for the ladies' afternoon tea. Though there was no lady, there hadn't been for nearly a decade. But the bell rang every day, just after 2, and every day, Margaret, or one of the others, would arrange the same china, set out 2 sugar cubes, pour boiling water over dried rose hips in a pot with a crack no one could find. No one ever drank it, but it always cooled, and then it always vanished. Margaret once tried skipping that task. The next morning, her boots were missing. They were found in the drawing room, upside down on the piano keys. She never skipped it again. The rest of the afternoon was filled with errands, polishing brass stair rods, refolding napkins for the linen chest, checking the pantry for root rot. It was while reaching for a bundle of carrots that she noticed something odd, a trail of flour on the floor, leading away from the larder and up the back stairs. It was too thick to be accidental, as if someone had deliberately dragged a handful of it behind them. She followed it halfway up before it vanished. Not faded. Vanished. Right where the staircase curved left toward the old music room. She turned back. Mrs. Harrow caught her on the landing and scolded her for wasting time. Margaret didn't mention the flour, By 4 o'clock the house was quieter again. The master and his guest had retreated to the library. The staff were preparing for evening duties. The fire in the great hall had been lit early, unusual considering it was not yet October. But the temperature had dropped, and more than one servant had mentioned a feeling, a sort of heaviness, in the west wing. That wing had been closed for years, after the incident with the governess. No one said what the incident was, only that it had been unfortunate. Margaret had to pass near it to collect a basin from the linen room. As she stepped into the corridor, a draught pulled at her apron. No windows were open. Her lamp flickered. She did not stop. She did not breathe. She walked, slow and steady, until the corridor ended, the door shut, and she was safe again in the linen room. Inside, the scent of lavender sachets grounded her. Dry linens, folded neat, predictably, solid, clean. And for now, she could pretend the rest of the house was just a house, nothing more. Even if, just behind her, a small brass button rolled off the shelf on its own. By 5 o'clock, the sunlight had begun to fade. Not disappear, just lose its colour. The stained glass in the stairwell turned from ruby and emerald to dried blood and swamp water. The gold trim on the banisters looked more like tarnished brass. This was Margaret's least favourite time of day. Not because it was busier, though it was. Not because her legs ached, though they did. But because this was the hour when the house felt off. There was no better word for it. Even the cook, a woman who feared neither storm nor scullery rat, would light a second candle when preparing the evening meal, just to make the shadows smaller. Dinner service began with preparation of the sideboard. 7 covered dishes, 3 varieties of wine, 2 sauces that no one ever touched but were expected anyway. Margaret was tasked with preparing the warming trays. She hated that job. The warming trays lived in the corridor cabinet, a tall, narrow cupboard at the end of the green hallway. No windows, no lamps, just cold tile and a smell of damp paper. The key was heavy, made of iron, and always warm to the touch. No one knew why. She fetched the trays quickly, not looking into the back of the cabinet. Never look too long into dark spaces. She'd once heard the old maids say, they tend to look back. Back in the kitchen, the cook was humming. That, in itself, was unusual. She was peeling turnips with a small knife and muttering, something about the visitor not eating much, though no one else had seen the visitor leave. Margaret didn't ask. By 6, the bell rang for dinner. The butler ascended the main stairs with the tray, each step slow, deliberate, as if counting out sins. Margaret remained below, cleaning dishes that hadn't been used, polishing silver that had never been touched, straightening a rug. No one walked on. She checked the pantry again. The flour trail was gone now. The carrots were still there, but they had been moved, subtly. She could tell because she always arranged them by size, and the largest one was now on the left, not the right. She adjusted them back without comment. The bells rang again. The library. Then the west hallway. Then the upstairs linen press. 3 rings. No voices. She checked the schedule board. No one was assigned to the linen press at that hour, and no one had stepped foot into the west hallway since the governess fell. They said she had tripped. But people don't usually trip with their hands folded neatly across their chest. Margaret didn't answer the bells. She pretended she didn't hear them. The house, she reasoned, was old. Wires and pulleys and springs. They got tangled sometimes. That's all. At 7, she was assigned to the music room. She hated the music room, not because it was grand, though it was. The walls were panelled in black walnut. The chandelier had gas lighting and actual crystal drops. The piano, a Broadwood upright, hadn't been tuned in years but still played too well. She was meant to dust the cabinet. Inside, sheet music. Some of it handwritten, some of it signed. She didn't open the scores. Once she had, just once, and found a note scrawled in faded ink. Don't play the third key. No one explained it. She didn't dust the piano that day. She left the music room with her shoulders tight and her hands cold. The lamps in the hallway sputtered as she passed, even though they were freshly filled that morning. At 7:30, she was back in the scullery, rinsing crystal under lukewarm water, when the house fell silent. Not quiet. Silent. No footsteps. No voices. No distant thud of coal buckets. The kind of silence that made your own breathing feel intrusive. She paused, hands still submerged, and waited. Nothing. Then, from above, 3 slow knocks. Not on a door. On the ceiling. Right above her. No one lived in the ceiling. The third-floor attic had been sealed 5 years ago, after a fire destroyed part of the rafter. She knew because she had helped carry up the buckets. She dried her hands slowly. She did not go upstairs. She finished the glasses. She swept the scullery floor twice. She tightened the soap bin lid, even though it didn't need tightening. And when she finally did leave the kitchen, she carried her candle with both hands, like it was a shield. On her way back to the servants' wing, she passed the long mirror in the vestibule. She never looked at it. Not since the winter morning she saw a second face in it. Not behind her, not next to her, but where her face should have been. Tonight, it was covered with a cloth. Someone had draped a linen napkin over it, as if tucking it in for sleep. Margaret didn't remove it. Back in her corridor, she passed the laundry chute. She paused. The flap was ajar. It hadn't been earlier. She closed it, tightly, and as she did, she noticed a small handprint, not dirty, not wet, but pressed into the wooden panel like heat on glass. Small, too small. She walked away without blinking. In the servants' quarters, a single lamp remained lit. The others had all gone out. It wasn't oil shortage. They had just been refilled. She climbed into her cot, blanket rough but welcome. Outside, the wind had picked up. Rain tapped faintly on the far wall, or perhaps it was something else. She didn't check. Above, the pipes groaned, and from the other end of the corridor, someone coughed. No one slept in that room anymore. It had been empty since Henry the footman left. Some said he eloped. Others said he saw something in the linen press. No one asked what. Margaret closed her eyes. In a house like this, you learned what not to ask, and more importantly, what not to see. There's a quiet that only comes after the last bell has rung. Not the hush of a room cleared for tea, nor the silence of a hallway between footsteps, but something heavier, something that seems to press in from the corners of the house, as if the walls themselves have stopped breathing. It was nearly 10. Margaret had folded her apron, stacked it with the others, and placed it in the basket beneath the iron hooks. The kitchen was dark now, the hearth down to embers, the smell of boiled cabbage lingering like a memory no one wanted. She had meant to go straight to bed. She'd even passed the second stair without glancing up, but then she remembered the lamp in the linen closet had been left burning. That lamp was oil-fed. It was never meant to stay on, and if Mrs. Harrow discovered it in the morning, Margaret would be blamed. So she turned back. The linen closet sat just beyond the west hallway, past the second drawing room and the little alcove where the walls bulged for no architectural reason anyone could explain. The flame was still burning. She opened the closet door carefully. The light flickered over folded pillowcases, over shelves lined with thin lace runners. Everything in place. She reached for the lamp, turned the knob. The flame shrank to a pinhead, and then flared again. Not wildly, just enough to be contrary. She tried again. It obeyed. She waited a moment longer than she needed to, because the linen closet always felt like it held its breath, and because last time she'd heard a sigh behind her as she closed the door. Tonight, new sound. just the click of the latch, just the hallway, dim and still. She made her way back through the corridor, one lamp every 20 feet, all spaced evenly, though one always flickered, and no one could say why. She reached the servant's door, pressed her hand to the knob, hesitated, because she'd heard it. That sound, just once, soft, insistent, like someone exhaling behind the pantry wall. She told herself it was the pipes. It was always the pipes, old, groaning, fickle. They hissed, they clicked, they did not sigh. Back in the servants' wing, the air was cooler. It always was at night. She passed Eliza's old room. Eliza had married last spring and moved to Devon, but her door remained shut. Locked, actually. Margaret had tried once, just to check if her comb was still inside. The key didn't fit. She paused at the wash basin. The mirror above it had fogged, but the basin was empty. She wiped it clean with her sleeve. There was a line on the mirror, drawn in something that resisted the cloth. A single arc, like the start of a letter. She didn't finish wiping. She crawled into her cot, blanket pulled up to her chin. The oil lamp by the hall flickered once. Then again, a draft whispered across the floor. There were no open windows. She counted backward from 20, a trick her mother had taught her to calm the mind. At 12, a floorboard creaked. Not from above, from below. The cellars were locked, always locked. She pulled the blanket over her head, listened, waited, fell asleep. Not easily, but completely, because exhaustion will do that, even when the night hums with a memory you can't quite name. In another part of the house, the drawing room had gone completely still. The fire, though snuffed an hour ago, still glowed faintly in the grate, as though something had stirred the ashes. The lace curtains fluttered. No breeze. A teacup on the sideboard shifted a fraction to the left. No hands touched it, and on the far wall, beneath the portrait of the lady in the blue dress, the faintest impression of a shoe print appeared, pointed outward, as if walking away, but there was no one there to see it, just the house, breathing again. As it always did, after the last bell. It was just past midnight, when the noise returned. Not a creak, not a moan from the rafters, but a deliberate sound, a tapping, 3 times, then silence, then again, always 3. Margaret awoke without moving. Her eyes stayed shut, her breath shallow. She counted to 10, then opened them. The room was dark, save for the faint flicker of the hallway lamp, leaking under the door. She listened. No footsteps, just the tapping. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the wall, right behind the linen shelf, the one bolted to the stone. She sat up slowly. Her blanket had slipped to the floor. She hadn't moved, and yet it lay folded neatly, as though placed there. She rose, bare feet touching the cold brick floor. The air smelled faintly of iron and beeswax, and something older, not rotting, not foul, just forgotten. She pressed her hand to the stone behind the shelf. Cool, still. The tapping stopped. She waited. Then, from behind her, the unmistakable sound of a drawer sliding open. She turned. Her cabinet shut tight every night, now ajar. The top drawer, the one that held her comb, her handkerchief, and the small brass button she had found 3 days earlier. The button was gone. In its place, to a scrap of paper, folded twice, worn at the corners. She opened it slowly, expecting nothing. Inside, in faded brown ink, a name, Ada. That was not her name. She didn't know anyone by that name. She folded the note, placed it back in the drawer, and closed it with care. The hallway lamp flickered once. She did not sleep again that night. By morning, the house had returned to its routines, as if nothing had shifted. The fire was relit, the bread was sliced, the silver was wiped and set. Margaret moved through her tasks without speaking. Her hands performed from memory. Her mind remained elsewhere. She passed the master's study on her way to the side stairs. The door was open a crack. Inside, she could see the end of a chair leg, a cigar tray, a pair of boots. Except the master had not returned from London. He had departed the morning prior. She remembered clearly. He had shouted at Mr. Elridge for misplacing a ledger. He'd taken the carriage. The housekeeper said he wouldn't be back until Wednesday. And yet, boots. She stepped back. The door clicked shut. No breeze. She did not tell anyone. In the pantry that afternoon, while fetching cloths, she noticed a new label on the shelf, written in neat cursive. Ada's things. Do not remove. No one else seemed to see it. She asked Thomas, the footboy. He looked at her sideways. There's no Ada here, he said. Never has been. Margaret nodded, said nothing more. That night, she took the note from her drawer and placed it in the pocket of her apron, just in case. 2 days later, while dusting the eastern stair rail, she heard singing. Very faint, very soft. A lullaby. Not in English. She didn't know the words. She followed the sound, past the portrait gallery, past the locked parlour, down the narrow stair by the old cloakroom. It led her to the small blue room, a guest room, unused since before she arrived. The door was open. Inside, a child's cot, a blanke drapel over it, a small wooden horse on the floor. None of those things had been there before. She stepped inside. The song stopped. The air smelled like lavender and old rain. She reached out, slowly, and picked up the horse. It was warm. Behind her, on the wall where the mirror should have been, hung a frame, empty, just a nail and a wire, and the faintest shape of a face, reflected in nothing at all. She left the room, closed the door, did not return. That evening, during supper prep, the cook asked her if she had seen the small silver ladle. Margaret shook her head. Later, while polishing the hearth, she found it in her apron pocket, wrapped in the note. No one had placed it there. No one could have. She kept it there until night, then returned it quietly to the drawer in the sideboard, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Ada." The candle beside her flared once, then calmed. She did not speak of it again. But from that night onward, the linen folded itself just a bit straighter. The pantry door no longer stuck, and every now and then, when Margaret passed the east stair before bed, she would leave a peppermint candy on the third step. It was always gone by morning. No crumbs. Just gone. The house, it seemed, remembered its ghosts kindly. If you were kind in return, the house didn't speak. Not in words, not in voices, but in patterns, and Margaret, though only 14, was beginning to notice them. After the 5th day, the name Ada no longer felt foreign. It felt familiar, like a name you'd heard in a dream, then forgotten, only to hear it again while rinsing tea leaves from a cracked cup. The pantry label was gone now. She had checked twice. The note with Ada's name had vanished too. One moment it was tucked in her apron pocket, and the next, just air. But Margaret still remembered. She began asking quietly, not directly. She asked the butler if he had ever known a second maid before her. He frowned, said the house had always been short-staffed. That's why she was promoted so quickly. She asked the cook if there had ever been a nursery here. The cook paused, said there used to be one, long ago, before the fire. Margaret asked where the fire had started. The cook didn't answer, only stirred the stew harder. That night, Margaret dreamt of lace curtains and smoke, of a little wooden horse that wouldn't stop rocking, and of a face in the mirror that blinked out of rhythm with her own. When she awoke, her feet were dusty. The floor beneath her cot was covered in fine ash. But the rest of the room was clean. She said nothing. The next day, while folding hand towels, She found a scrap of fabric in the washroom, linen, a child's sleeve, embroidered with a tiny A near the hem. She took it to Mrs. Harrow, asked if it needed mending. Mrs. Harrow stared at it for a long time, then said flatly, "That doesn't belong here," and burned it in the kitchen stove. The flames crackled too loud. Margaret didn't ask again, but that night, the bells rang again, not the ones on the service board. The tiny bell in the nursery hallway, the one that hadn't been connected in over a decade. It rang once, then twice, then silence. Margaret waited 5 full minutes before creeping up the servants' stair to the second floor. The door to the blue guest room was shut, but there was a smell in the air, lavender, and something else. She didn't open the door. Instead, she turned to the hallway table, where the oil lamp always sat. Next to it, a folded note. No envelope, just 3 words. She was kind. No name, no explanation. She left it there. She did not check again. The next morning the lamp had been moved. The note was gone, but someone had left a peppermint on the table, and Margaret, without thinking, tucked it in her pocket, as if it had always belonged to her. The house was quieter after that. Not silent, not still, just less restless. The bells stopped ringing at odd hours. The cellar no longer echoed when no one was inside. Even the third stair by the library no longer groaned under invisible weight. Margaret did her chores. She swept and folded and polished. She still found things out of place, but now they felt more like reminders than warnings. A child's ribbon in the laundry, tied neatly in a knot she didn't know. A song hummed once, faintly, then gone. A key in her apron she had not picked up, but which unlocked the linen closet's stuck drawer. Inside that drawer, nothing except for a small wooden block, the kind toddlers play with, etched with a capital A. She left it there, didn't touch it. She didn't need to. That evening, as she passed the main hall, she caught her reflection in the tall side mirror. For once, it looked just like her. No delay, no second face, no shadow behind her shoulder. Just Margaret, tired, smudged with ash, but whole. She nodded to herself. She would leave the peppermint as usual, and the house, whatever it was, whoever it remembered, would keep her safe a little longer. Ada, whoever she had been, had made sure of that. Margaret wasn't sure why, but in that place, some kindnesses didn't need explanations. By the end of her 3rd week, Margaret no longer flinched when the hallway lamps flickered. She no longer paused when footsteps echoed with no shoes nearby, no longer checked the pantry twice when things were moved. She had, without meaning to, become part of the house. Not in the way a painting is part of the wall, but more like how a well-worn chair knows its owner. Quietly, without question, the routines helped. Breakfast at Sion, bell for the drawing room at 9, polishing silver on Thursdays, turning the mattresses every second Monday. Even the oddities had their rhythms. The east corridor ran colder on Wednesdays. The old piano struck a note on its own, but only after rain. The mirror by the west stair never showed hats. It just didn't. The staff spoke less of these things now, not because they had stopped happening, but because silence made them gentler, more manageable. Some things, once named aloud, grow teeth. So Margaret folded napkins, poured tea that cooled on untouched saucers, wound clocks that didn't tick, and each night, as she passed the 3rd step near the nursery, she left 1 peppermint candy. No more, no less. The house never asked for more. Sometimes she thought about leaving, not because of fear, but because of the weight of it all, a weight not on her shoulders, but in her bones, like the floorboards knew her name, before she learned to write it. But each time she imagined walking away, she remembered the little things, the warmth that lingered just a second longer at the linen closet, The footsteps that stopped when she was tired, the way the sheets folded themselves better after she whispered good night. And she stayed, not because she was trapped, but because the house, for all its shadows and secrets, had never lied to her. It may have hidden things, it may have whispered, it may have dreamed while awake, but it never lied. And in this house, truth, even the quiet kind, was rare. One morning, as spring began to stretch its fingers, Margaret found a letter slipped under her door. No stump, no seal, just folded parchment, thick and yellowing. Inside, in the same hand as the note before, were 5 words: "You keep the memory alive." She smiled, not a wide smile, not the kind you show to others, just the small kind, the kind that sits behind your eyes. She tucked the letter into the back of her drawer, next to the peppermint tin, then rose, put on her apron, and began the day. The house breathed with her, not against her, not over here, with her, and somewhere between the ticking of no clocks and the creak of old stairs, a name was remembered. Ada, still kind, still near, still home. There were rules in the house, some written, some whispered, and some never spoken at all. The written ones were pinned to the pantry door: how to set a formal table, which bell meant which room, what time the meat arrived. The whispered ones were passed between maids in the hallway, between footboys on stair landings. Don't dust the portrait with the broken frame. Don't wind the upstairs clock if the moon is full. Don't go into the blue room unless the candle stays lit the whole way up. And then there were the other rules, the ones no one admitted knowing, but everyone followed anyway, like never calling someone by name if they left too suddenly, or never speaking about the time the wallpaper peeled by itself, or why the nursery bell was never disconnected, even though the nursery had been locked since the last snowfall of 1883. These rules didn't keep the house quiet. They just kept it calm. There's a difference. Margaret had learned this not from instructions, but from presence, from the way the older servants moved, from how Mrs. Harrow refused to speak after dusk unless spoken to first. There was a rhythm to things, a shape to the silence. It was not a fear that kept them quiet. Not exactly. It was something closer to reverence, as if the house was more than wood and stone, as if it was watching, not unkindly, but attentively, and those who ignored that attention didn't last long. There was once a maid named Cora, before Margaret's time, but her name still hovered in conversations, like a tea stain never fully scrubbed from linen. Cora had been bold, not cruel, not loud, just bold. She opened doors too quickly, whistled in the corridor, made jokes about the butler's cough being ghost-born. Then one day, she found a locket at the back of the silver drawer. Inside was a painting, not a photo, a miniatura, done in sepia and too much detail. The face was smiling, but the eyes were scratched out. Cora wore the locket for 3 days. On the 4th, she tripped in the great hall, fell backward, struck her head on the marble base of the staircase. She survived, but she didn't speak after that, not for weeks. Then one morning, she packed her things. No goodbyes, no requests. She walked out through the side gate, past the hedges, and was never seen again. Her locket remained on her bedside table. It was gone by sundown. No one mentioned it after that, but no one whistled in the corridor anymore either. Margaret had heard that story from Thomas, who had heard it from Grace, who had once been scolded for humming near the piano. Stories moved in layers, like dust on old fabric. You didn't always know where they started, but you knew better than to shake them loose. There were other names too. Isaac, the second footman, who refused to enter the wine cellar after seeing something there that didn't cast a shadow. Martha, the scullery girl, who never touched salt after she found a mound of it neatly poured, in the shape of a ring near her boots. No one knew who poured it, or how it stayed unmoved for 4 days. But from then on, every servant kept a pinch of salt in their apron fold, just in case. Margaret did the same. She didn't know why, but it felt balancing. One evening, as she folded laundry, she noticed a thread pulled loose from a tablecloth. It coiled in a strange pattern, not tangled, not knotted, more like cursive writing, but in a language she didn't know. She showed it to Mrs. Harrow. The housekeeper stared for a moment, then took the cloth silently and placed it in the fire without a word. Margaret asked nothing, just nodded. That was how things worked here. You didn't need reasons, only rhythm. Every servant had their own ritual. The butler tapped twice on the door frame before entering the drawing room. The cook tied a red string around the stove handle every Tuesday. Mrs. Harrow left a teaspoon upside down on the mantel in the west hallway once a month, always during the waning moon. No one asked why. And Margaret, she whispered good night at the end of the hall before turning in. Not to anyone in particular, just to the hallway. It made the footsteps stop, most nights, and on the nights they didn't, she hummed the lullaby she barely remembered from childhood, the one with no words. That seemed to help. The house, after all, was not cruel, but it noticed, and it remembered, which meant, in some quiet way, you were never really alone, not while you still followed the rules, even the ones no one said aloud. Every house with history has a room that no one quite explains. In this one, it was the clockmaker's room. That wasn't its real name. It had once been a guest bedroom, then a sewing room, then a storage space for holiday china. But long before Margaret arrived, and long before Mrs. Harrow had even grayed, people called it the clockmaker's room. No one remembered why, except maybe the house. It was the room at the end of the south corridor, just past the old library annex. The one with the warped door frame and the handle that never quite turned smoothly. It wasn't locked. It wasn't boarded up, but no one used it. Not because they were forbidden, just because. Margaret first heard the story from Nora, the ironing girl with the long braid who always wore 2 left shoes by accident. It was after supper, near the pump well, while waiting for the bucket to fill. Nora said it casually, like she was talking about the weather. That room ticks, she said, even when there's nothing inside. Margaret had laughed at first, a quiet laugh, the kind you offer so someone else knows you're listening. But Nora didn't smile. She continued folding towels and said, "They say he stayed here a long time ago. The guest built clocks in the cellar, but always brought them up to that room to test them. Said the light was better, even at night." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "There's no window in that room." "I know," said Nora. "That's why." As the story went, the man wasn't a servant, nor a noble, just a visitor. He kept to himself, ate little, slept odd hours, paid his bills in coin no one recognized, but that the master accepted anyway. And every night he carried up a different clock, some with pendulums, some with chimes, one with no hands at all. He would sit for hours, facing the wall, listening, not winding, not adjusting, just listening. One morning, he didn't come down. The maid sent to knock said she heard ticking, louder than usual, more layered, like 30 clocks ticking at once. But when the door was opened, the room was empty. No man, no clocks, only the sound, that ticking, soft, insistent, endless. They closed the room for a time, used it only for storage, but things went missing. Silver trays, shoelaces, a ledger book, the side panel from a grandfather clock, all found later inside that room, placed neatly, in corners, facing the wall. The housekeeper at the time declared it coincidence, blamed the footman, threatened pay cuts, but no one entered that room unless they had to, and even then, only during daylight. Margaret didn't believe it at first. Not really, but after hearing it from Nora, she began to notice little things, like how the handle to that door was always slightly warmer than the others, or how the south corridor never quite stayed lit, even when the lamps were fresh, or how, some evenings, she heard a faint tick just as she passed the staircase landing, even though no clocks were nearby. One night, curiosity crept in. She crept down the south hallway after evening tea. No lamp, no sound. The door was closed. As usual, she placed her hand on the handle, paused, listened. Nothing. She turned the handle slowly. It moved. The door opened halfway, with a long sigh of hinges. The room was dark, still, empty. She stepped just 1 foot inside, then stopped. She could hear it, not loud, just faint. A tick, and then another, but not from the same source. They came from opposite corners, then above, then underfoot, layered, unrhythmic, like many clocks, each set to its own time, trying not to agree. She stepped back, closed the door, did not open it again. The next morning, the tray she had polished the night before was missing. It was found that afternoon in the library, but not where trays go. It was leaned against the wall, facing inward. Margaret did not ask, did not touch it. She walked past, eyes lowered, and as she passed the side table, she heard it again. Tick, just once. Soft, low, but there. She turned the corner, returned to her tasks, and hummed the lullaby that didn't have words. Some things, she thought, don't need answers. They just need distance, and perhaps respect. Whatever the clockmaker had been building, whatever time he had been listening for, it hadn't finished ticking yet, and the house, kind as it could be, still remembered his rhythm. There were moments when the house didn't feel like something around you, but something inside you. It didn't happen often, and it didn't happen to everyone. But for those who stayed long enough, longer than one season, longer than a single harsh winter, there came a night when they realized the silence of the mansion had moved inward. It didn't hurt. It didn't even frighten. It simply settled, a cold in the bones that wasn't from weather, a stillness behind the eyes that made blinking feel like too much motion. Margaret first felt it while cleaning the upper gallery one rainy evening. There was no wind, no thunder, just grey light, and the soft drip of water down the window panes. She had been dusting the ledges, her hand moving in circles, not really thinking. And then suddenly, nothing, not silence, not pose, just the absence of self. She could not recall how long she had stood there, hand on the cloth, breathing steady. It might have been seconds, might have been longer. When she stirred again, she wasn't cold, but her fingers were wet, the cloth soaked. Though she had not reached the window, she didn't speak of it, not to anyone, because some moments didn't translate into language. They only translated into knowing. The others had felt it too. You could see it in how they moved. Thomas, who used to hum while sweeping, now did so silently. He still moved the same way, still swept the same arcs, but his eyes had changed, like he was looking at the floor, and something beneath it at the same time. Grace, the chambermaid, had once been brisk, efficient, full of quiet fire, but now she paused before entering any room with more than one mirror, and never turned her back fully on the hearth, not because of something that happened, but because of something she began to expect. It was the kind of change that wasn't announced, only absorbed. The younger servants sometimes resisted. They called it nonsense, blamed creaky floors, the wind, rats in the wall. Some left within the month, said the air smelled too thick, said they dreamed badly, said the curtains never stopped shifting, even with the windows shut. but a few stayed. And in time, they too began to speak less. Not from fear, but from adjustment. You didn't conquer the house. You adapted to it. Like putting on an old coat, one slightly too heavy, slightly damp at the seams, but warm all the same. Margaret learned to feel the quiet before it arrived. She could tell when the house was about to hush, in that strange, watching way. It was in the way the oil lamps flickered sideways, not up, in the way the floor under the great stair gave just a little more, in how the bell cords grew stiller, even when untouched. And when that moment came, she would pause, hands folded, eyes lowered, and she would wait, just long enough, not as if waiting for permission, not apology, but acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you, and I will keep walking anyway." That seemed to satisfy the house, at least most days. She began to think of the house not as a place, but as a rhythm. There were good days, quiet, calm, the kind of days where the bread rose properly and the clock hands all agreed. Then there were tense days, days when the windows fogged despite no rain, when the nursery door refused to stay shut, when the shadows felt thicker. Those were the days when Margaret would walk more slowly, speak more softly, and leave an extra peppermint on the stair. She didn't know why that helped, but it did, and so she kept doing it, because in a place like this, your reasons didn't need to make sense. They only needed to work. She sometimes wondered what would happen if the house ever became too quiet. Not the usual stillness, but a full stop, no creaks, no ticks, no shifting boards. Would the walls collapse? Or would something finally speak? She wasn't sure which frightened her more, but until that day came, she swept the same corners, folded the same towels, and whispered the same good night. And when the house whispered back, as it always did, in its own way, she simply nodded, because the house was part of her now, and she, in some quiet way, was part of it. The cellar door was painted black, not dark green, not deep brown, but black, flat, silent, uninviting. It sat at the end of the back corridor, just past the laundry press, and behind the iron stove used for boiling linens. Most of the younger servants didn't know it existed. The door had no bell above it. No key was kept on the usual rings, and the corridor itself had fallen out of use. Too narrow, too damp, too unnecessary. But the older ones knew, and they avoided it. Margaret didn't learn about the door until her 4th month. Even then, it was only because she dropped a copper spoon while carrying a tray of oil flasks and watched it roll straight down the corridor and stop in front of that door. She hadn't meant to follow it, but she did, and when she reached the end of the corridor and bent to pick up the spoon, she heard something behind the door. Not a groan, not a knock, just a breath. Long, measured, not like someone inhaling, but like the house itself exhaling. She didn't turn the handle. She didn't even look directly at it. She picked up the spoon, stood carefully, and walked back, slow, deliberate, as though noise might wake something. Later that evening, she asked Thomas if there was a second cellar. He dropped his butter knife. "No one goes there," he said. Then added, "There's nothing down there." Too quickly, she asked no more. But after that night, she began noticing small things. A breeze, faint and chilled, moving against the direction of the open window. A smear of coal dust along the stairwell wall, even though no one had carried coal that day. And once, just before dawn, she found her broom leaning against the cellar corridor wall. She hadn't left it there. No one claimed they had. One afternoon, Mrs. Harrow summoned her to carry folded linen to the upper bedroom. On her way back, Margaret took the back stair, the one that wrapped close to the outside wall and was used mostly by footmen. Near the landing, she felt it again. That chill. Not cold air, but something heavier, She paused, listened. From far below, through layers of floor and stone, came a sound, not loud, but rhythmic. A scrape, then a pause, then another, like something dragging along stone. Slowly, not urgent, not aggressive, just steady. She told no one, but she began avoiding that stare, and every time she passed the back corridor, she walked just a bit faster. Weeks passed. No one mentioned the cellar, but the feeling returned. One evening, she found a stack of folded towels placed just beside the black door. Neat, clean, slightly damp. She asked around. No one had left them there. No one had gone down that corridor in days. At least, not knowingly. She carried them back to the linen room, but when she opened the top towel, she found a single grey button, stitched into the corner seam. A small one, not standard. Too soft for uniform, too fine for kitchen cloth. She left it on the shelf. It was gone by morning. Margaret began keeping a pebble in her apron. A small one, taken from the garden path. She wasn't sure why, only that she needed something real. In her hunt, whenever she passed that end of the hall, because the deeper truth was this. Sometimes, when the house creaked at night, when the wind didn't quite match the movement of the curtains, when the sounds didn't echo the way they should, it didn't feel like something was beneath the house. It felt like the house itself was built on top of something that was still trying to come up, not with force, not yet, but with patience. And Margaret, for all her calm, was not ready to know its name. So she left the door untouched, and every Sunday she placed one folded cloth at the top of the corridor with no explanation, just in case that was all it wanted. Something clean, something small, something soft to hold on to. There was always a man in the garden, not always the same man, or at least not always from the same angle, but he was there, near the hedge, behind the old sundial, bent over a patch of lavender that hadn't bloomed in years. Margaret saw him first on a Tuesday, just after lunch, while hanging linens near the south fence. He didn't look up, didn't wave, just adjusted his hat, knelt again, and disappeared behind the bushes. She thought nothing of it. Every large house had a gardener, someone to tend the rose beds, to keep the vines off the windows, to rake the gravel path just so. Except she couldn't recall ever seeing him indoors. Never at meals, never at roll call, never during deliveries. She asked Thomas who he was. Thomas frowned. "There's no gardener," he said. "The master lets the weeds grow now, says it adds character." Margaret didn't argue, but later that week, she saw the man again, this time near the greenhouse frame, straightening a cracked pane, quietly, carefully, and once more near the willow tree, on a morning so foggy, she wasn't sure she'd seen anything at all. But the grass where he stood was always flattened, pressed down, briefly darker. One night, while drawing water from the pump, she found a basket placed beside the well. Inside, cut rosemary, fresh, bundled with twine. No note, no explanation. The kitchen had not requested herbs. The cook said she hadn't used rosemary in weeks. And yet, there it was, waiting, like an offering. Margaret dried the bundle and placed it near the hearth. The fire burned brighter that evening. No one asked why. She began to watch for him more carefully. Not often, not obsessively, just now and then. At dusk, there was often movement by the lower hedge, a figure just barely visible, trimming, adjusting. Once, she saw him tie a small ribbon to a rose stem. It fluttered, then was gone. She asked Mrs. Harrow again. The housekeeper paused, wiped her hands on her apron, and said quietly, "Some men stay on long after their tools rust," then walked away. Margaret didn't press. In early spring, When the daffodils bloomed late, a small clay pot appeared outside the scullery door. Inside, fresh bulbs, perfectly arranged, damp earth, still breathing, no footprints in the dirt nearby, no marks on the step, just the pot, and the scent of something old, but not unpleasant. She planted them behind the kitchen wall, in the patch no one used. They grew, faster than expected. By May, they were already fading, as if they'd bloomed for someone else, someone who only stayed for the first sun, then returned to the hedges. Margaret never spoke to the gardener. She never saw his face. Not clearly, not directly, but she began leaving the back gate slightly ajar, just in case. And when she passed the lower path, she sometimes whispered thank you, softly, without knowing why. The rosemary never wilted. The gravel stayed even. The vines didn't scratch the window frames. Not once. That entire season. Some help. Asks for nothing. Not even a name. Especially not a name. And that, Margaret thought, was its own kind of kindness. No one slept on the third floor. Not anymore. Not since the fire. Not since the family moved their bedrooms to the east wing. And the guest rooms were sealed, one by one, without ceremony. But sometimes, late at night, long after the house had settled, the lamps up there flickered on, just one, never two. A soft glow behind frosted glass, golden, still, wrong. Margaret saw it first in early November. The sky had been dark by 5. The rain had passed, but the air still smelled of smoke and copper. She was returning from the side pantry when something caught her eye through the narrow window in the back stairwell. Light, not from a lantern, not candlelight, a steadier glow, a room lit, but with no shadow passing in front. She blinked, paused, counted to 5. It stayed, then vanished. The next morning, she asked the butler if any guests had arrived late. He said no, checked the registry, gestured to the list. Empty, but Margaret could still see it, in her memory, the exact angle, the way it sat low in the frame, as though placed deliberately, not left behind. A week passed, then it returned. This time Margaret wasn't alone. Grace saw it too. They didn't speak. They just looked up, then looked away. No one said a word. The third floor was not forbidden, just unused, unheated, dust heavy and creaking. But even so, Margaret noticed certain things, like how the broom cupboard always held one too many mops, even though inventory matched, or how the door to the linen overflow room never stayed shut. It always eased open, just half an inch. By sunrise, one day, Mrs. Harrow asked Margaret to retrieve a jar from the top shelf. In the dry goods pantry, the ladder was missing. She checked 3 closets, then, finally, the stairwell. And there it was, propped neatly against the wall, leading up toward the 3rd floor landing. She hadn't heard anyone move it. No one claimed it, but it was there, and the top rung was dusty, except for a single handprint, too small to be the butler's, too large to be Thomas's. She didn't climb. She fetched a chair instead. The ladder stayed untouched for days, then disappeared again. That winter, the light came back, more often. Always the same room, far left corner, curtains drawn just enough. Never moving, never flickering, and always gone by morning. No smoke, no warmth, just an after-image. On the glass. One night, as the house braced for snow, Margaret stepped outside to fetch kindling. She turned back toward the 3rd floor window, and this time the light was on, but the curtain was pulled aside, just a little, enough to see the edge of a rocking chair, moving, slowly, deliberately, no figure, no silhouette, just the motion, back and forth, back and forth. She dropped the firewood, did not look again, Some weeks later, a letter arrived for the master. It was addressed from Oxford, from a cousin. Inside the envelope, a photo, a group of children posing stiffly on a velvet rug. On the back, in faded ink, upstairs after tea in the West Nursery. No one remembered a West Nursery. The household had no records of it. But Mrs. Harrow grew quiet for a full day after seeing the photo. And that evening, the lamps were lit early. Margaret passed the stairwell at dusk. The light was already there, waiting. She never climbed those stairs, never knocked, never touched the door. But once a month, on the 13th, she left a folded handkerchief on the second-floor landing. Nunoch, no ribbon. It always disappeared, and the light, though it still returned, never moved again, just steady, still, present, as if whatever waited up there was content to be seen, but not remembered. Margaret understood. Some rooms aren't haunted, they're just lonely, and the light wasn't a warning. It was a way of saying, I am still here, quietly, gently, enough. By the time winter passed, Margaret had stopped asking questions, not because she no longer wondered, but because the wondering had softened into something else, something quieter, less urgent, more like understanding. The house did not give answers, not in words, not in signs, but it offered rhythm, patterns, repetition, a knock at dusk, a drawer left open, a candle burned just a little shorter than it should have, and when you lived inside that rhythm long enough, it stopped feeling like fear. It started feeling like company. Not comfort, exactly, but presence. The kind of presence that fills a room even after everyone's gone. The kind that lingers in the folds of curtains, in the quiet between footsteps, in the warmth of a chair no one remembers sitting in. The other servants felt it too. They no longer flinched when the bells rang off schedule, no longer asked who had moved the kitchen stool, or why the mirror fogged on only one side. Instead, they adjusted. A teaspoon left turned on the mantel, a peppermint on the third step, a lullaby hummed in a hallway that didn't echo anymore. Not habits, not rituals, just accommodations, like sharing space with a roommate who never sleeps, but always listens. Sometimes Margaret would catch herself speaking softly into a room she thought was empty. Just a word, a thank you, a sorry, a not today. And sometimes, when she did, the room seemed to settle, like an exhale, like something had been heard. That was enough. No ghosts appeared. No lights flickered in approval. Just stillness. Just peace. As much peace as one could hope for in a house built over layers of memory. There were things that stayed, not because they were trapped, but because they had nowhere else to go, no one else to hold their name, no one else to walk the halls the way they once did. So they stayed, in doors that opened by themselves, in candles that burned uneven, in songs half remembered, half invented. And Margaret, though young, understood something most never did, that not every haunting is a warning. Sometimes it's just a request to be remembered. She never tried to leave the house. Not seriously, not with a packed bag, not with a final step toward the gate, because the idea of leaving felt like leaving behind more than just a place. It felt like turning away from someone who had trusted her with their silence, and so she stayed, polishing silver that tarnished faster in certain rooms, sweeping corners that never stayed clean, folding towels that were always one too many. She lived with the things that stayed, not because she had to, but because they had nowhere else to go, and maybe neither did she. There was a mirror on the second floor, tall, thin, framed in a wood no one could name. It stood at the end of the east hallway, just before the linen closet and opposite the door to the sewing room. No one remembered who put it there. It wasn't listed in the house inventory, didn't match the furniture in any room, and yet it had always been there. As far as anyone could say, Margaret first noticed it on her second week, not because it was out of place, but because it wasn't dusty. Every other surface in that hallway gathered dust, faster than it should. The wainscoting, the sconces, even the floorboards grew a grey film by noon. But the mirror? Always clear, not sparkling, not polished, just clear, like someone cleaned it, but no one ever did. The first time she caught her reflection there, she paused, not because it looked wrong, but because it looked too right, like her image had been waiting a second longer than it should have, like it had braced for something she didn't yet know. She stepped closer, studied it, her hair slightly uneven, her apron wrinkled, a smudge on her chin from the stove. Normal, real. And yet, when she looked away, she felt watched, not in the way of eyes on her back, but of something waiting for her to look again. Over time, she began to test it. Not seriously, just in passing. She would glance at it sideways while carrying linen, step out of frame, then back in. Once, she lifted her hand in a slow wave and waited to see if the reflection hesitated. It didn't, but her fingertips felt cold for the rest of the day. She told no one because the others already knew. They avoided that mirror without speaking of it, walked on the opposite side of the hallway, found reasons to take the back stair instead. One day, Grace dropped a handkerchief just in front of it. She bent to retrieve it, then paused. When she stood again, her face was pale. She didn't speak for the rest of the shift, and never walked that corridor alone again. Mrs. Harrow claimed it was just a mirror, but she never dusted near it, never touched the frame. Margaret once tried, just a gentle swipe of cloth across the base. It left no streak, no mark, but the cloth came away slightly damp and smelled faintly of ash. She didn't try again. Some nights, when the oil lamps burned lower than usual, the mirror caught light, even when the hallway was dark. A glint, a glow, nothing obvious, just enough to suggest that something inside it was brighter than the space around. And once, just once, Margaret thought she saw a second figure behind her in the glass. Small, blurred, gone too quickly to name. She turned. Nothing. Only the corridor. Still, silent. But when she looked back, her reflection had not yet moved. Just for a second. Just long enough to know. The servants began leaving small things by the mirror. A dropped pin, a folded scrap of paper, a single button. No one admitted to placing them, but they disappeared by morning. The mirror never changed, never cracked, never shifted. It simply stood, watching, reflecting, holding something too old to name, but too familiar to ignore. Margaret began to whisper as she passed. Not words, just a sound, a hum, like the end of a lullaby. She didn't know why, only that it made the hallway feel less cold. One day, the glass fogged slightly as she passed, only briefly, and in the fog, before it faded, she saw a handprint, small, delicate, facing inward. She didn't wipe it away. By the next hour, it was gone. But from then on, the mirror felt quieter, less waiting, more listening, as though it had been seen in return. And for a mirror, that may have been enough. In the side dining room, just off the pantry and 2 doors down from the study, hung a clock. Plain, brown, unremarkable. It ticked, not loudly, not sharply, just a steady tick, soft enough to ignore, but always there. No one remembered who hung it. It didn't match the wood panelling. Its face was slightly tilted, and the brass hands had tarnished unevenly, but it kept time, perfectly, Always. Even when the rest of the house fell behind, when the grandfather clock in the great hall needed winding, when the butler's watch ran 2 minutes slow, this one remained exact, never adjusted, never opened, never touched. Margaret passed it often. The dining room was used for informal meals, for guests who didn't require ceremony, for tea taken in solitude. She walked past the clock 4 times a day, sometimes more. It never stopped, not even during storms, when the house groaned and the oil lamps flickered. Not even during the week the power failed, and half the east wing went dark. Still it ticked, even when silence swallowed everything else. One morning, as she polished the cutlery, Margaret noticed the second-hand skip. Not forward, but backward, just 1 notch. Then it resumed. She thought she imagined it. But the next day, it happened again, and again, always once, always at the same time, just before the bell rang for midday tea. Tick, back, tick, forward again. No one else seemed to notice. She asked Thomas, but he said the clock made him uneasy, too quiet, too patient. He didn't like eating in that room. One Thursday, Margaret lingered after lunch. The room was empty, the dishes cleared. Only the clock remained, ticking. She stood beneath it, tilted her head, and listened. There was no winding key, no access panel, just the face, the case, and the sound. She placed a chair beneath it, climbed, and peered behind. Nothing, just wall, cold stone. She placed her hand on the wood. It was warm, not recently sunned warm, but gently, deeply warm, like a kettle left near the hearth. Alive, in its own way. She climbed down, didn't touch it again. That winter, the dining room was closed for repairs. A pipe had cracked. Ceiling began to flake. The workers entered once, left quickly, and refused to return. They didn't explain, just muttered about drafts and strange echoes. The room remained sealed for 6 weeks. No one entered, no one passed through. But still, if you stood in the pantry late at night, you could hear it. Tick, tick, tick. And once, when Margaret dropped a pan at midnight and bent to pick it up, she swore the ticking stopped, just long enough to let the silence notice her. Then it resumed. When the repairs were done and the room reopened, the clock remained untouched, still ticking, still perfect, still slightly off-center. Margaret said nothing, but from that day onward, she avoided looking at it directly, because sometimes, when she caught it in the corner of her eye, the hands didn't move, and yet time passed. Lunch was served. Lamps were lit. The sky turned pale, and when she looked again, the hands had caught up, as if they hadn't needed to move to keep pace. They simply knew. The clock was never wound, never polished, never even dusted. It collected no grime, no fingerprints, no attention, but it never failed. And for a servant in a house that remembered too much, a clock that always kept time, she felt less like a tool and more like a witness, watching, waiting, measuring everything that couldn't be measured, and keeping count of things no one else dared record. The attic was not locked, just avoided. It wasn't on any schedule. No rooms were assigned for cleaning. No bell wires led to it. It was simply there, above the 3rd floor landing, past a door painted the color of dust. Margaret didn't plan to enter it, but one morning, after a heavy wind rattled the east windows, she was asked to check for broken panes. The usual servant for such tasks was away. No one else volunteered, so she went, up narrow stairs, each one thinner than the last, until the air grew still and dry. She opened the door slowly. The attic smelled of old paper, wax, and time. Not decay, not rot, just time. She checked the windows first. all intact, then turned to leave, but caught sight of a small desk, half covered by a moth-eaten blanket. On instinct, she lifted it. Beneath, a shallow drawer, stuck but not locked. She opened it. Inside, a book, bound in faded leather, edges softened. No title. She lifted it carefully. It felt warm, and slightly heavier than it should. She didn't open it there. She carried it downstairs, tucked in a folded cloth, and placed it on the pantry table. Later that night, when the house had quieted, she returned and opened it. It was not a diary. No names, no dates, no stories, only entries, one per page. Short, consistent, numbered. Like this: 47. Fog came early. One knocked twice. Let it pass. 48. Do not speak on the stair when she sings. 49. If the shoes are moved, wait until morning. 50. Pantry door creaks. Offer tea before questions. No signatures. No explanations. Just reminders. Instructions. Warnings. Rituals. Margaret turned the pages slowly. The ink changed shade halfway through, from brown to black, then back again, but the handwriting remained the same, even, measured, calm. She read 20 pages that night, then closed the book, wrapped it, placed it back where she found it, not in the attic, but on the pantry shelf where the cook kept the unused candlesticks. No one noticed, or if they did, no one asked. But that week, Margaret saw 3 things she hadn't before. First, a trail of soot leading from the fireplace to the back stairs. Second, a pair of gloves on the laundry table, damp, but no one had worn gloves that day. And third, entry number 63, which had not been there before. 63. When asked what you heard, say only the wind. She hadn't remembered reading that line, but now it was there, in the same ink, same hand, waiting. Margaret kept her distance. She didn't read the rest all at once, only when needed. She found herself opening it when something felt off, when the air changed, when the mirror showed a flicker too long, when the bells rang out of turn, and the book never failed to answer. Not directly, not clearly, but enough. Entry 71. The third drawer should stay empty. Entry 72. Do not ask what waits in the basin. Entry 73. If it forgets your name, repeat it once, then leave. No one else seemed to use the book, but someone had. The pages bore fingerprints, the corners worn, some passage underlined. In faded pencil, Margaret once left a slip of paper between the pages. When she returned, it was gone. In its place, a small sprig of lavender, dried, tied with string. She didn't question it, just returned it to the top shelf, in the pantry, where it waited, silent, still, like the house itself, writing its own memory, one entry at a time, and hoping someone would keep reading. There was a room near the west wing that no one used. It wasn't locked, wasn't broken, just left alone. Once a sewing room, then briefly a reading nook. Now it was empty. Empty, except for the chair. A rocking chair, plain, wooden, the kind you find in front of fireplaces in stories. But this one sat in the corner, facing the window where no fire had burned in years. It didn't match the rest of the house. Too simple. Tornero. The legs slightly uneven, as if it had been carved by hand, but not by a master. Still, it rocked. Not constantly, not violently, just gently, now and then. Even when no one was near, Margaret first saw it move during a storm. The house had gone quiet, not from fear, but from listening. The rain had stopped, the lamps had dimmed, the hallway was still, and in the corner of her eye, she noticed the motion. Back, forth, back, forth, slow, even. She paused. The window was shut. No draft, no vibration. Just the chair, to rocking, as if someone had just stood up, or never had. She didn't tell anyone, not because she feared disbelief, but because some things grew heavier when named. Instead, she began to observe. Every few days, she would walk past the room at different hours. Morning, afternoon, after tea. Sometimes the chair sat still, still as dust. Other times, it moved, subtly, steadily, but never in rhythm with footsteps, never in sync with the world around it. It had its own timing, its own breath. One afternoon, she stepped inside, just a few feet. The chair didn't move, didn't creak. It stood there, quiet, facing the window, framed by the fading light. She felt neither welcome nor unwelcome, just observed. She placed a folded towel on the seat, a simple offering, something soft, uncomplicated. The next day, it was on the floor, not dropped, not crumpled, folded, neatly, deliberately, as if returned. Margaret never sat in that chair. No one did. But once she saw footprints near it, small, not child-sized, not booted, just present, pressed into the dust, then gone. And another time, she left a peppermint on the windowsill. It stayed there 3 nights. On the 4th, it was gone, and the chair was turned slightly, facing the door. The cook said the room felt wrong. Thomas avoided the hallway entirely. Even Mrs. Harrow walked quicker, past the threshold. No one admitted why. No records mentioned the chair. No servant inventory. No house blueprints. But still it remained. Still it moved. Even when the window was nailed shut. Even when the floor was braced during repairs. It rocked back, forth, as if time in that room moved differently, or waited for someone who had not yet returned. Margaret came to think of it, not as haunted, but as patient. It never rushed, never cried out, never tried to be noticed. It simply continued, moving gently through hours no longer measured by clocks, and that, in its own quiet way, was more unsettling than any ghost, because ghosts ask for release. But the chair, it had already accepted that it would stay, forever rocking for no one, in a room no one used. In the sewing cabinet beside the west stair lay a piece of cloth, folded, plain, cream-coloured linen, frayed slightly at the edges. It had been there for years, maybe longer, tucked beneath loose buttons, half spools of thread, and a pair of silver shears that no one used. Margaret found it by accident. While searching for a thimble, she unfolded it slowly. Across the cloth, a needle still hung in place, its thread looped mid-stitch, as though paused. The pattern was floral, half a wreath. No names, no date, just winding vines, and one unfinished bloom. In the lower left corner, it wasn't signed, it wasn't labelled, but someone had begun it with care, and then simply stopped. She asked Mrs. Harrow, who had started it. The housekeeper only shrugged. "There's always 1 or 2 like that," she said. "Too many tasks, not enough hours." Margaret understood. But something about the cloth lingered. It was clean, not yellowed with age, not stained by years in storage. It felt recent, fresh, even though no one could remember seeing it before. She left it folded, but not hidden, set it neatly on the cabinet top, as if returning it to the light. The next morning, the thread had shifted, only slightly, a single new stitch, tight, even, different from the rest. She didn't say anything, not at first, but each time she passed the cabinet, she checked, and each time there was another stitch, sometimes two, sometimes a curved line, always matching the pattern, always just enough to notice, never more. Margaret began watching who passed that hallway. Thomas never entered. Grace walked quickly. The cook had no interest in threadwork, and yet the embroidery continued. A petal formed, then a leaf. Then the stem curved, just a bit more. She began to wonder if it wanted to be finished, or if it simply couldn't stop. Not yet. One evening, she placed a small spool of thread beside the linen, the same colour, a soft green. She didn't touch the cloth, didn't move the needle, but by dawn, the green thread had been used. 3 new leaves, almost imperceptible. She returned the next night with a thimble, then a brass button, then a single daisy pressed between pages. Our item disappeared by morning, and the embroidery grew, still slow, still quiet, but certain. Mrs. Harrow never asked why the cabinet door stayed open, never commented on the supplies. But one afternoon, Margaret found a folded note beside the cloth. Small, no signature, only 5 words. She never got to finish. After that, Margaret no longer added to the cloth. She simply checked it every few days, watched the bloom complete, watched the vines curl, watched the needle shift, and one morning she found it done, the pattern complete, centered, symmetrical, the thread still threaded, the needle placed gently in the top corner, and beside it, a single pearl button. She left it where it was. The cloth never moved again, but from that point on, Margaret noticed something new, a quiet in that hallway, not empty, not cold, just settled, as if a breath, long held, had finally been released, not with noise, not with tears, but with one last stitch on a bloom that had waited years to appear. In the drawing room, where dust settled slowly and the curtains never moved, stood a harp, not a grand one, not golden or carved, just simple wood, its varnish faded, base uneven. It leaned near the tall windows, where no one sat anymore. There were no strings, only the frame, curved and quiet, with pegs that hadn't been turned in years. Still, no one moved it. No one touched it. It wasn't forgotten, just left, like something that had finished speaking. Margaret noticed it first on a Monday. She'd been sent to dust the mantel, though the room was barely used. The harp stood in the corner, facing the space where people no longer gathered. No one mentioned it. Not Thomas, not Grace, not even Mrs. Harrow. When asked, the housekeeper only said, "Let it be. Some things still listen." Margaret didn't question. She kept her distance. But the harp never felt empty, only waiting. One rainy evening, while passing the open door, Margaret paused. The room was still, the light low, and yet something lingered in the air. Not a sound, but the memory of one, as if the room had just finished singing. She stepped back, heart steady, but unsure. There was no music, no wind, but the silence was shaped like a song. That night, she dreamed of notes, soft, familiar, not from memory, but from something older. The next day, she left a flower on the harp's base, a small violet, nothing more. When she returned the following morning, it was pressed flat, as if held gently overnight. She began to leave other small things. A ribbon, a torn page from a hymn book, a copper button. None were taken, none were moved, but each, in its own way, changed. The ribbon curled, the paper yellowed too quickly, the button warmed to the touch. Margaret said nothing, neither did the harp, but the air around it grew softer, like breath exhaled and never drawn back in. Sometimes, in the hour before tea, She thought she saw lines, not shadows, not cracks, but the faint outline of strings in the sunlight, just for a moment, then gone. She never spoke of it. Some things lose their music, but keep their memory, and sometimes that's enough. The harp never played, never hummed, never stirred, but it stayed, as if presence was its purpose, not performance. And Margaret, though she never sat, never touched, never asked, began to hum quietly each time she passed. A note, a shape, something to fill the room, without sound. The harp didn't answer, but she always felt heard. By the end of her second year in the house, Margaret had learned not to ask why some objects stayed and others vanished. She had dusted rooms where no one walked, tucked linens into wardrobes that hadn't been opened in years, and carried tea past chairs that shifted slightly between morning and dusk. Not enough to blame on drafts, just enough to notice. There were things in that house that never spoke, never moved, never glowed or groaned or bled, but they remembered. The mirror in the hallway, the one that never dulled, the clock that ticked without winding, the book in the attic drawer that added lines even after it was closed, the rocking chair that waited in a room no one entered, the embroidery that finished itself with a patience Margaret had never seen in people, the harp that had no strings, and yet knew when to listen. None of them asked for attention, none demanded fear, but all of them carried something too old to be thrown away and too silent to be explained. The house did not haunt, it held moments, names, unfinished histories, half-breathed songs, and it kept those things inside its furniture, its fabrics, its wood and paper and dust. The servants never spoke of it, but they stepped more carefully around certain corners. They hummed in rooms that were too still. They placed small offerings, a fresh cloth, a dried bloom, a coin from a pocket they never meant to empty, not because they believed, but because believing didn't matter, noticing did. Margaret began to understand that the house was not just bricks and oil lamps. It was memory, pressed into matter, and those objects, those quiet things, were the pages. You didn't read them aloud. You turned them gently, watched how they changed when no one else was looking, and sometimes, if you listened long enough, they turned themselves. She never felt watched, but she did feel seen, by the chair in the corner, by the thread left on the windowsill, by the soundless harp, and in return, she saw them too, not as haunted, not as cursed, but as kept, like stories that never made it into words, but still wanted to be remembered. When the bell rang at midnight and the house sighed into sleep, Margaret would walk the halls slowly, letting her eyes rest on each object, as if greeting a friend. She would nod to the mirror, pass the door where the chair sat in shadow, touch the corner of the cloth in the sewing drawer, and somewhere between the pantry and the stairs, she would whisper, not loud, not often, just enough. We're still here, not because they needed reminding, but because she did.